Afternoon and see how many of you would be voting if you had to actually pass this test. That might be weighted because a number of my students are in here who already took this test on Monday. So when we look at the voting rights in the United States, so we start with the colonial America and the right to vote. You go back and you look at who had the right to vote. Well, you had to have a property. And if you didn't have property, then you could not vote. And at that particular time, for instance, in 1787, only 6% of adult Americans were voting. So all white males over the age of 21 with property. Black males also in the following states had the right to vote. So in 1776, we see Delaware and Maryland that gave black men the right to vote. In 1777, it was New York that added black men, again, with property. 1784, New Hampshire. And then in New Jersey, adult women with a specific amount of property could also vote in New Jersey. And that was something new that I found out because I really did not know that until I started doing this research. Then with the 1790 naturalization law, only free white men could become citizens. So with that, it bought everybody else who was coming to the United States and who was free, it bought them from voting. So again, in 1792, you had New Hampshire to drop their property requirement. So with the drop in their property requirement, that meant that white males could vote without property. And then in 1807, remember, women had the right to vote, and then in 1807, New Jersey took that right away from women. So they started out voting, then 20-some odd years later, they were denied the right to vote. By 1856, all white males are allowed to vote, regardless of property. At the same time, what is happening in the United States, you have black men that are now being stripped of their right to vote. For instance, in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey, black men are now being stripped of that right to vote. We also had a religion in the right to vote. A number of British North American colonies had a religious test. So for instance, if you were Jewish, if you were Quaker, if you were Catholic, you were denied the right from not only voting, but, voting and running for office. And so here's an example of Delaware's 1776 Constitution. And it stated that every person who shall be chosen as a member of either house, appointed to any office, a place of trust before taking the seat, entering upon execution of this office shall also and subscribe the following. I, whatever their name is, do profess faith in God, the Father, and in Jesus Christ, his Son, the Holy Ghost, and one blessed forevermore. And so here, once again, you have to have this acknowledgement of the scripture. And so if you're not considered what they would be called a Christian, you are not allowed to vote. So in 1787, writing of the Constitution, in Article 4 of the Constitution, while it declares that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office of public trust under the United States, remember that the right to vote was not truly granted by the federal government. It is up to each state at that time to decide exactly who they are giving this right to. So we see that it took almost over 30-some odd years with Maryland in 1828, that became the last state to drop their religious requirement when it gave Jews the right to vote. So all before this, Jews did not have the right to vote. And so with this, white men can no longer be denied the right to vote because of their religion. Now, let's move on to women and the right to vote. We know that during the abolition period, women were fighting not only for abolition of slaves, but they were fighting to have more rights. As a matter of fact, Abigail Adams, even in revolutionary times, when her husband was out and fighting for the revolutionary for the United States, she sent him a letter. And what she said to him, look, while you are setting up this new government, do not forget about the women. If you put all the power in the hands of the men, they will be tyrants if you let them. And he kind of like dismissed it. He says, my God, I could never have thought that you would have even been thinking of such rights, because number one, with women, they were not supposed to be thinking of politics and anything else strenuous because they just were not suited for that type of thought. So in 1848, you get the Seneca Convention, which is like the first convention on women. And they have this, just a decree that they write up. But what it does, it almost resembles the Declaration of Independence. But what it says is that he, meaning men have denied us this, men have denied us that, when it comes to all of our rights in this country. And it went a little farther than the Declaration of Independence because it also set up resolutions what men can do. So in 1869, you get the proposed amendment, the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment was the amendment that was going to give black men the right to vote. However, remember, you have had women that was also fighting for this right to vote. And what this did, since women were not included in this right to vote, it caused a rift in the women's movement at that time. You have one group of women who, Susie B. Anthony and Elizabeth Stanton, their whole thing was that, look, we should also be given this right to vote. And you had a number of women who felt that, wait a minute, if black men who we consider to be the least among us are going to be getting this right to vote, then why are we not also getting this right to vote? You had the other group, Stone and Howe, who said, look, let's get black men the right to vote first. Because they thought that if they put women on this, added women to the amendment would not pass. So it broke up to two different groups, and then in 1890, once again, they came together. Wyoming became the first state to give women the right to vote. And we had Janetta Rankin right here, who became the first woman elected to Congress from the state of Montana. And this was before women had the right to vote. So in 1920, so this is 50 years after the 15th Amendment, that the 19th Amendment is passed, and it is giving women the right to vote. So looking at black men and the right to vote, and after the 15th Amendment. So we get the Civil War amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law. And then the 15th Amendment give black men the right to vote. And so from 1870, and that should be from 1870, that should be 1901, I'm sorry, not 1991. That's a mistake on that. So from 1870 to 1901, you had 24 black men that served in Congress. You had 22 who served in the House of Representatives, and you had 2 that served in the Senate. And remember, all of these men are coming from the South under Reconstruction, and they are all Republicans at the time. So we have Rebel from the state of Mississippi. He becomes the first black U.S. Congress, Senate person in 1870. And then you have Rainey, who becomes, again, South Carolina, 1870, the first U.S. House of Representative member. We start to look at legislation that Congress has passed in to try to protect black men and the right to vote. We get the Enforcement Act, making it illegal to interfere with someone's right to vote. Then we get the Civil Rights Act of 1872, which is known as the Anti-KKK Act. Once again, making it a federal crime to interfere with someone's right to vote. Then we start to see a rolling back of those rights. And that starts to take place in 1876 when we get the disputed election between Tilton and Hayes. So you have Tilton, who is the Democratic president, you have Hayes, who's the Republican candidate. It is one person gets the majority of popular votes, the other one gets the majority of I can't even think the word right now, electoral college votes. And so what happens is that you get this compromise of 1877. And what the compromise says is that the Democrats will allow the Republican to be seated, to become the president of the United States. In return, the Republicans have to pull all of the troops out of the South. And so then we get an end to Reconstruction, and the South goes back to doing exactly what they want to do. So they started to pass policies. We get the grandfather's clause, meaning that if your grandfather did not vote before 1865, then you cannot vote. You get a poll tax, meaning, for instance, you would have to pay a tax in order to vote. And that is why today, if you go and you need an ID to vote, not a driver's license, an ID, that ID should be free. Because if it is not, then that becomes a tax on the vote. And that is illegal. The literacy test, what you have right now, that is a written test, but the test could be anything. How many bubbles are in a bar of soap? How many jelly beans have we been sitting on a jar? But just about anything. Then you have to pass a good character test, which is simple as the register looking at you and saying, yes, you have good character, or no, you do not have good character. Other things that took place during this time was all white primaries. So you had a number of states that if they were letting black people vote, they would not let them vote in a primary, only the general election. So therefore, the ability to be able to say who you wanted to represent you in the general election, you were denied that. The Supreme Court, until 1944, held this up as legal, and then in 1944, it's Smith versus all white people overturned this policy. Then we see a lot of fights going on for people, for blacks trying to get the right to vote. And I just want to go. This is Selma, Alabama, right down here. And what took place March 7th, marching to Capitol to be able to get the right to vote, and they were beaten up by the police. And right after this, what we see is that you get the 1965 Voting Rights Act that is passed. And so just more pictures that people want to get. I'm going to come back to that, but let me move to Native Americans. So in 1848, when it comes to Mexicans, right after the Mexican War, while they were given citizenship, however, they were denied the right to vote. When they did get the right to vote, a lot of people still could not vote because of the English requirement and then intimidation. So 1968, remember the 14th Amendment, where it gives blacks citizenship, but it say all persons born are naturalized as citizens of the United States, but in 1876, you have a report saying no, that did not apply to Native Americans. 1887, you get the Dawes Act, which grants citizenship to Native Americans who would give up their tribal affiliation. Then, once again, in 1890, you get the Indian Naturalization Act that says that Native Americans have to apply for citizenship. Then in 1952, you get the McCarran-Walters Act, which grants all Asian people of Asian ancestry the right to citizenship. So then that allows them to vote. Then we start to look at some of the rollbacks that have been taking place. And it was been starting a long time, but then we get Shelby County versus Holter in 2003. And then you start to look at some of the impacts of that. For instance, voter ID, and I'm just going to go past this because I know that you're going to cover this. So voter ID, and the thing about one of the reasons that people are saying about voter ID is because there's supposed to be a lot of fraud that is going on. But however, that is not true, because they did a case study through the years where they looked at over 1 billion votes that were cast, and they found something like 30 people that had voted illegally. Cutting to early voting has been another one. And what we see, for instance, North Carolina, it goes from 17 days to 10 days. And so you have all of these long lines, and that discourages people from voting, because if you show up and a line is wrapped 2 blocks around the corner, you will probably pick up your stuff and go home. Another big thing is the number of felons that cannot vote in this country. And people are looking at that as a civil rights violation. For instance, we have 6.1 million felons who are not allowed to vote, and that's over 7% of the voting population. Then I just want to go back, and I'm just going to mention this very, very shortly. And this is a case that has been going on since 1971, and it came to a head this week, and this is Waller County, Texas, with Prairie View University. This is a university, it has about 10,000 students at this university. And 80% of the students at this university happen to be black. And the county have been playing all types of tricks to keep these kids from voting in this particular county. And it started in 1971, and it's been going on and on and on since 1971. And so we could also look at a couple of other things, roll back. We start to look at voter ID, and this just happened also, where if if you're living on an Indian reservation, you will have, for instance, a post office box, and not truly an address. And now, so you have to have on your ID an address, and people only have post office boxes. And so once again, you can be denied the right to vote. And I'm going to stop there, turn it over.
And I'll thank Dr. Broussard. I'll get you going here.
Perfect. Thanks. Awesome. Thanks, everybody. I'm really, really excited to be here with you all. Can you guys hear me all right? Yeah. Awesome. I'm really excited to be here with you, and I know that the Brewers aren't everybody's mind, so you only have a little time to tune in and focus on democracy. So my name's Molly McGrath. I grew up here in Wisconsin. I grew up in Wisconsin Rapids. Is anybody from Wisconsin Rapids? Stevens Point. Oh, Stevens Point. Marshfield? Awesome. Tigers. So I'm a voting rights attorney, but what I do is, not that I'm not in court every day. Instead, a lot of the voting rights work that happens is right here on the ground, talking with people, working with people one-on-one who have been impacted by these laws. And as Dr. Broussard told us, that our country has complex history with voting rights that it's not always been for everyone. It's not always been accessible to everyone. Not everyone's ballot always counted. And as Dr. Starr started talking about what's happening now, we saw that, you know what, this is still a problem now. This is a problem in 2016, this is a problem in 2018, and this is why, you know, I have my job. I say to myself almost every day that I feel so lucky that I have the job that I do, but I really hate that we have to be doing this work in 2018. And so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about the work that I do, about what is this voter suppression. So we're going to look at things kind of how we got here, and then we're going to put a really big spotlight here on Wisconsin and what this voter ID law is. How many folks have heard of the voter ID law? How many of you students? Oh, come on, 5? Yeah? How many have read a newspaper article at all about voter ID? How many of you have voted before? Oh, well, awesome. How many of you are 18? Or how many are under 18? Oh, so everybody in here can vote. How many of you have not voted yet for the first time? Leave your hand up if you are going to vote for the first time. Awesome. So we'll definitely be looking at why voting rights is actually on the ballot this election in so many different ways. And also we're going to talk about people. People are who's impacted by these laws. We see the statistics, but we're going to talk about real people who are right here in Wisconsin who are impacted by this voter ID law. And then at the end, we'll definitely have time for questions, so different questions that you have about something you heard. I'll also just love comments. So if you have feedback, something that really struck you as interesting, that you have a question about, or reminded you of something else, I'd love to know that. And then any questions too that you have to make sure that you are ready to vote, and we'll make sure to share those resources with you and other ways that you can get involved. So how did we get here, right? We heard a little bit from Dr. Broussard about this long and really complex and ugly history that we have, and where are we now? Where are we nationally? What is going on? Because we hear, I saw all the hands, that we hear about voter ID, we hear about voter suppression, and so what does this look like? So let me tell you, it's not always been this way. That voter ID hasn't always been the norm. And since 2010, in fact, you can see here with the red on the bottom being these strict voter ID laws, that there is a very clear increase in the amount of laws that we've seen. So this is certainly not the norm, and this is certainly a current battle. And if you look at things nationally, here are the states that have voter ID laws. So we can see Wisconsin with the dark green. That is what we call a strict voter ID law. And so we are one of the states with actually the strictest ID laws in the nation, and we'll talk in more details about what that means. And both of these charts, by the way, are from a source, not myself, but the National Committee of State Legislatures, which did show up there. So if we look closely at Wisconsin, what does this mean for us here? What does this mean for our parents, our grandparents, our neighbors, us as students? What does this mean when we just want to vote? So in Wisconsin, we saw it since 2010, all of these states who decided, hey, voter ID is a great idea. We're going to do this. We're going to put this on in our state. And each state can make their own law how they want. And in Wisconsin, we created a voter ID law and passed that law in 2011. Well, right away, the ACLU said, hey, this isn't right. People aren't going to be able to vote because of this. This is going to violate people's fundamental, that sacred right to vote that people have fought for. We have to do something about this. We want to get rid of this law. And so right away, the ACLU sued, and it was going to be in effect. And then in 2014, the Supreme Court said, oh, no, this law, it's not going to work. It is going to violate rights. Wisconsin, you can't implement it for this election. And then even now, there's 2 lawsuits pending still. That first one at the ACLU that we've been battling since 2011, and then another lawsuit in another federal court that's called One Wisconsin Now v. Thompson. So there's 2 different lawsuits that are still now on appeal at the 7th Circuit saying, wait a minute, this isn't right, that this is a violation of rights. So there's still this court battle that continues around Wisconsin's voter ID. And what we saw because of these court battles at 2016, so that presidential election, that was the first time that this law was in place statewide. How many of you voted in 2016? So that was the first time. How many of you, it was your first time voting in 2016? Okay. So for you, that was the norm to show your ID. But for everybody else in Wisconsin, that was a new thing. That was this whole other step. And what we know is, 2018 elections are really happening now. So early voting is happening in places across the state. We've had elections earlier this year. We've had elections in 2017, and we still have this photo ID law in place. So what does that mean for voters? So the idea in the work that I do is really to fight the suppression at every angle, that these court battles are essential, and they're one component, and of course, we hope we win, but ultimately, in the meantime, this ID law is in place. We saw that it's in place, so what are we gonna do to make sure that everybody knows about it, that everyone can vote, and that everybody has the ID that they need? So when you think of, how many of you are registered to vote? Awesome. So when you think about registration and ID, it's helpful for me to think that there are 2 really different things. So you have registration, and then you have vote. And so in all those states that we saw that don't have a voter ID law, that's how those states still work. You still register to vote, and you still attest that you're a U.S. citizen and over 18 and eligible to vote, and you're still on the rolls that way, and then you vote. But if you have a strict photo ID law, like those dark green states that we saw, or those other states that have other types of photo ID laws, you have this whole other step. So you have this whole other burden and this whole other hurdle to clear before you vote. That's different from registration. And so that's 2 totally different steps there. Either you need to go and get an ID if you don't have one, or you need to figure out how the law works and make sure that you have the right ID in your pocket and take it with you on election day. So in kind of thinking of how the things that you're supposed to be proving when you're doing these steps, one, for registration, that's kind of about proving your residence. So that's all about proving where you live. So when you register, you fill out your address. They ask for proof, maybe a piece of mail. You maybe use your tuition statement to show this is my address, this is where I live. Maybe you used your driver's license if your current address is on your driver's license. But that can be your photo ID, but it doesn't need to be. It can be your tuition statement, a utility bill, a lease, something without your picture on it. And then for photo ID, remember that's that whole other separate step. So that's all about proving your name and who you are, your name and photo. So it can be your Wisconsin state ID, driver's license, passport, your one of your student IDs that you get here, the secondary one. So things that aren't really related to your address at all, in fact, aren't related to your address at all and where you live. And if it's confusing, it's supposed to be. That's part of the design. So if you're looking at this and wondering why Dr. Broussard said we can't do literacy tests anymore, it's kind of like one, because by design, it's supposed to be confusing. So, I saw hands up when we said, well, we've heard about and read these articles on Wisconsin's voter ID law. What's this thing with voter ID? Why does Wisconsin get so much attention about the voter ID law? And it does for a few different reasons. One is because it's strict. And we saw a couple states have these strict voter ID laws. And what does that mean? So what it means is when you go and vote, you can only show one form of ID from a special list that lawmakers wrote. So you either have that ID, you get to vote a regular ballot, or you don't. There's no wiggle room at all. There's no corroboration. It's either yes, you have that ID and you get to vote that regular ballot, or you don't. There's nothing that you could say, hey, my classmates behind me in line, they can vouch for me that I'm not in the grad. or my neighbor's my spouse. There's no wiggle room like that. There's no other affidavit that you can sign and say, you know what, I've had this idea, I can't get one. Can I sign something that says, I'm Molly McGrath, by penalty of perjury, please let me vote and let my vote count. We don't have those options. So you either have one of these IDs and you're into, the Democracy Party, or you're not, and you're excluded. So that's what, when you hear about strict photo ID laws, that's what it means. It's either one or the other, without exception. Another reason that we hear a lot about Wisconsin's ID law, and this is something that, I would never, I never want to say to voters, because if you all make sure that we get you the IDs that you need, but ultimately in Wisconsin, the way they set it up, it's actually difficult to get ID. It's difficult for two reasons. One, it's difficult to have access to the right information on what do I take for the DMV to get an ID? Do I need a birth certificate? What do I need? What IDs work? What do I need to take to the polls? All of that information looks like a literacy test. And second, it's hard because it's hard to get access to the DMV. It's hard to get access to a DMV that's open more than twice a week if you live here in Platteville. Hard to get access to a DMV that's open after 5 o'clock, when you'd be done working and not have to take time off. And also hard to get access to a DMV that's open on a weekend. There's two, one in Madison and Milwaukee, and only 18. So we required this ID, but then we didn't really give folks any increased access to what they needed to know to get that ID, or where they needed to go and how they needed to get that ID. And the last and third reason that Wisconsin's ID law gets so much attention is really because lawmakers just flat out didn't put their money where their mouth is. So we saw one of the strictest laws in the nation. There's no wiggle room. And then what? Let's spend very little money actually telling people about it. So in 2016, the first time that this law was in place, about $250,000 was spent informing the public on how this new law would work. And we really saw the effect of that up close. So when we talk about how strict and tight this law is, this is it. This is this, special list that lawmakers put together that you can have. So Wisconsin state ID or Wisconsin driver's license, a passport, a VA card, military ID, tribal ID, certificate of naturalization, and certain student ID. And then along with that, there's also additional qualifications that they put along with the law. So if you have a Wisconsin driver's license, you can use that as long as it didn't expire before November 8th, 2016. And for student IDs, I say certain student IDs. How many of you have a student ID from UW-Platteville? How many of you had to get a separate voter ID here in this building? Is anybody from out of state here? So with the student IDs, they didn't just say, oh, the student ID is on the phone, any student ID. Instead, they said, oh, student IDs, well, they have to be signed. They have to have issued a state, and you must also bring proof of address. So they added all of these extra qualifications to kind of uniquely draft this to include certain student IDs and exclude certain IDs. And you remember how the laws vary from state to state? Those photo ID laws are exactly the same. So lawmakers in each state decided, how are we gonna, include this, move over here, and use this to include certain people who would have that ID, and make sure that we exclude certain people. Make sure we set another hurdle for certain people, like students, to get that ID. So, specific to students, this is the ID that the University of Wisconsin-Platteville issued by that. It looks very similar to yours, I'm guessing, with different mottos. And because that didn't fit and doesn't have all of those additional requirements, like the signature, those aren't automatically valid for voting. So instead, schools had to create an additional ID to fit all of these additional criteria that would be valid for voting. So of course, students are a target of this voter ID law to make sure that there was an extra hurdle put up. Are keep people and certain people from voting. In Texas, you can vote there with a concealed carry permit, but you cannot use a student ID. So the idea of targeting students and putting these extra hurdles up for students isn't unique to Wisconsin either. So with all of this, what we saw in 2016 was kind of this perfect recipe for disenfranchisement, right? So we had one of the strictest laws in the entire nation. And then we had very little money to tell people about it and this difficulty getting an ID. So where did we land? We landed with a huge recipe for disenfranchisement. You all can use your imagination on who the salt and pepper shaker would be, what lawmakers might be celebrating, this lower turnout that we had, and people being disenfranchised. How many of you are wondering in your head how many people were disenfranchised, how many people could vote? Right? I get that question a lot. How big is this problem? You know, how big are we saying? And there's different studies that have been done about this. And what we saw, one came from University of Wisconsin-Madison, and all they looked at were Dane County and Milwaukee County. That's where the studies existed, and they said in these two counties, just these two counties alone, that a minimum of 16,800 people did not vote because of Wisconsin's photo ID law. And the kicker is, some of them actually had the right ID that they needed and still did vote. So when we think of that line, when we said a photo ID law means you have to either get the ID that you need or confirm that you actually do have that right ID with you. And when we saw that the state didn't spend enough money making sure that people knew how they needed to vote under this law, we saw the effect that people didn't have the ID and people were also confused by it. But one thing I really think is important is that, you know what? It doesn't matter exactly how big this is, because we know what happened, and you'll hear from some of these folks that if anybody couldn't vote, that this is, you know, the right to vote isn't just because the thousands of people could vote, this would have changed turnout, or would have changed the results of the election. That doesn't matter. What matters is that it happened. And if it happened to anyone in this room, just one person, that would be enough to say, wait a minute, you know, this isn't how America works. This isn't how the right to vote is supposed to work. This belongs to each and every one of us, not just to the margin of an election. So, but doesn't everybody have an ID? How many of you are thinking that? How can this happen, right? I say if I had $1 for every time I was asked that at different places, we'd have a lot of money in this room because I'm asked that a lot. And the answer is no, not everybody has an ID. Not everybody has an ID that's on that special list that lawmakers created for Wisconsin. So if you think of this kind of in two realms, you have students who would be, most of you in the room, who have the option to go and make sure you have that compliant student ID on campus. The campus has looked and said, you know what, we need to make sure that there's some ID that fits this extra qualification. Same picture, that maybe just has a signature now. And then there's folks who aren't students, who can't get that special student ID. You need to go to the DMV and figure that out. So we're gonna look at some of these folks. This gentleman is Steve. So Steve is one of the very first people who I met. And he was low income, he was staying on a buddy's couch, and he was driving snowplow. So in Wisconsin, you know, he was praying that it would snow so he'd be able to make $10 or $12 an hour and drive snowplow. And he called me, and it was a small February election, and he said, you know, I want to vote, And I went to the DMV, and they said, I want an ID, and it's free, right? There's a free ID to vote. And they said, well, you can get a free ID, but then you can't have your driver's license. And he said, oh, well, I lost my driver's license. I lost my actual photo ID, but I didn't lose my driving privileges. I just lost it, and I'm low income. And they said, well, you can get a free ID, but it would kick you out of the DMV system, and you'd lose your driver's license. What you actually need is a driver's license, and that's going to be $14. And he said, what? I'm trying to get back on my feet, and that's more than an hour's of my wage right now. And so he left, and we worked together, and he said, I didn't know that I could only have one or the other in Wisconsin. This seems like kind of like a poll tax, and certainly a form of voter suppression for a low-income person like me who wants to vote. And we worked together and ultimately got him a driver's license, and here he is voting outside the fire station that February. But my experience with Steve really taught me that, working one-on-one with voters and seeing what their lived experience is, hearing what their story is, really revealed just how deeply this suppression works, and that something like, doesn't everyone have an ID? You can just get an ID for free. That in practice, that's not really how the voter ID law works in Wisconsin. This is Cinderia. I met her at the library, and she told me that she needed to vote, and she needed an ID, and she moved from Chicago, and she said that her grandmother would be so disappointed if she didn't vote, so she needed to make sure that she got her ID before that election. And at that point, she had taken a bus twice to Chicago to get and purchase her birth certificate. She had to wait 10 days to get her Social Security card. And then here we are when we met and finally went to the DMV. So how Dr. Starr was saying, the poll taxes are illegal, right? And the ID has to be free. Well, voter ID laws are really a poll tax in disguise. That this is something that is 2 steps away from actually directly saying you owe money, you're charged, we're going to make you pay to vote. Instead, it's the tax of time, the tax of those underlying documents to get. This is Alfonso. I met him at a high school registration drive. And he sat down next to his peers. It was the high school had open campus for lunch, so a ton of people were in this kind of lobby way, in and out for this 40-minute period, and everyone was really excited to vote. So we were registering a ton of 18-year-olds and had a long table, and he sat down next to his peers and said, I want to register to vote. And the woman next to me was working with him and started registering him, and he got up and his peers got up, and someone said, okay, do you have a Wisconsin photo ID or a Wisconsin driver's license photo ID to take with you when you vote? And his friend said, yep, we got a driver's license. And he said, no. And they said, oh. And the woman gave him a piece of paper that looked as clear as you could make this law. And I saw him look at it, and I watched him. I saw him start walking down around the corner and toward his locker, and I saw him throw it away. So I ran after him and said, oh, we can help you get an ID. This will help get. He's like, oh, really? And I said, yeah. He's like, because I would have to take 2 buses to get to the DMV, and I'm in an after-school program, so I can't really get there by 4:45. And my birth certificate's over at my mom's house, someplace I think, so I would need to go over there to get that. And I said, no problem, we'll figure it out. And so here we are at the DMV when we did. But my experience with Alfonso really taught me, I think, 2 things about Wisconsin's voter ID law. The first is that, just passing someone a piece of paper, especially a new voter who's excited about voting and just saying, this is, good luck at the DMV and a pat on the back that this is how things work, that just isn't enough with this law. That it's so intricate and kind of like the comic that was up at Dr. Broussard's, it's almost like a maze for so many people, and certainly something that would discourage them from voting. And the second thing, and I think is kind of the most dangerous thing, is that, of course, this was going to prevent and really stymie Alfonso from voting in that upcoming election, in that first election. Probably wouldn't have voted, or he said he wouldn't have been able to vote and get his ID in time. But what does that say for the long term? That experience sends a signal to Alfonso, to certain communities, that this isn't for you, that you're not invited, you don't have the ticket in, and democracy's not for you. And I think that that is the most dangerous thing that we see about voter ID laws. Claudel, another gentleman, his birth certificate said Clardell because of his mom's penmanship. So it took us 3 trips to the DMV to get an ID. This is Zach Moore. It also took him a federal court order from a judge in order to get the ID that he needed to vote. This is Ruby, another person who was born by midwife in the South in the 20s. And here she is a couple days before the election because she had been denied an ID because she didn't have a birth certificate. She was born in a farmhouse. How she says the story goes is it was sometime around Thanksgiving in the 20s to a midwife. Never had a birth certificate because she lacked that. The DMV said was waiting and waiting to get her an ID. So when we continue to see the same communities impacted. Here's Fred. He's 99 years old. Here he is on election day. And remember when we said that this was a whole, for you guys, it was your first time voting, so you had this voter ID law, and that was kind of the normal. Well, for someone like Fred, he was 99 on election day. He'd been voting for 70 years in Wisconsin, and he rode his bike to the polls. The poll workers knew him by face. They said he actually volunteers at that school where he voted and reads to kindergartners and elementary school students. So people there recognized him. He had a faculty ID. He was a retired professor. He's also a retired World War II engineer. But he didn't have a Wisconsin photo ID. He doesn't drive anymore. He's not getting on an airplane. He's been voting in Wisconsin and registered to vote at that same address for 70 years. So when he went to vote, remember there's no wiggle room, there's no corroboration. You either have that ID and you get your ballot, or you don't have that ID and get that regular ballot. So his poll worker called me because of the amazing proactive poll worker and said, you have to help, there's a 99-year-old man here who's a World War II engineer. I mean, this is an American hero. We recognize him by face. Everyone here can vouch that his name is Fred Vidal, but we can't let him vote. And so we had to go to the DMV to get one of those IDs that was on the strict ID list in order for Fred to be able to have his vote counted in 2016. And we know for every Fred that there's others, right? We couldn't get to every Fred. This is Mary, a voter in her 70s, late 60s, who lived in Milwaukee, who wasn't able to get to the DMV on election day and get back to have her vote counted. Same with Gladys. Here Gladys is actually holding a government-issued photo ID. So a photo ID from Milwaukee County, it's the bus pass, it has her name, it has its photo. But remember how we said these laws are drafted in a way to have certain requirements and include certain people, and then weave over here to make sure certain people aren't included. Well, a bus pass by the city of Milwaukee, even though that's the photo ID with your name and photo, isn't included on this special list. So for the first time in her life in 2016, Gladys went to vote at the place she had been for years, and her ballot wasn't counted. Another woman, Andrea Anthony. This man, Elvin Miller, lived in Plymouth. He and his wife. This is a student in just this past election in 2018, this spring. So this is not just a 2016 problem, but this is a problem now, and a problem that young people have. But let me tell you that I'm not here to be all doom and gloom, that this is something that we can fix. And how do I help? Are you guys feeling like this is a serious problem? Here. So what I say is there's something for everyone, right? That wherever we are, that there's something for everyone, and that this is really an all hands on deck moment for democracy in Wisconsin and in the country. So if our history has taught us anything, it's what we can do. What we can do when we unite, what we can do when we all work together, what we can do when we start in our own communities and start really at that local grassroots level, talking to each other and working together. And when we all vote to improve the country we live in, and to improve access to the ballot for everyone. And this really comes from the same belief that I'm sure everybody in this room has, is that we want our elections to be safe, secure. We want every single person's vote, every single eligible vote, to be able to vote, and that vote to count. So there's a few ways that we are working together on this, and that we can get involved and continue to have you all involved and work together. So one of the ways that we are working on this is to meet voters where they're at, to go where folks are. So we have folks out canvassing, knocking on doors in parts of the state that had low turnout. A high school actually adopted the ward around the school because there was low turnout. So if you want to go and knock on doors, talk to impacted voters, we'll get you set up. Knocking on doors, making sure everybody can vote, everybody has access to the ballot and the information that they need. But the idea is to go where folks are, talk to impacted people, and make sure that they can vote. Similarly, we know that low-income people are impacted by this law, so going to places like food pantries, churches. This is a clothing drive that I was at in Kansas, and zero of these people were here to register to vote or to get an ID to vote. But we know who's impacted by these laws. We know low-income people are impacted. We know people of color are impacted. And so where can we go to find these folks and make sure that they're getting accurate information and what they need? And I have fireworks here because this is like the most important slide if you remember only one thing from this entire presentation, is that no matter what, when we work one-on-one with voters, is to make sure that people know we have their back. So today I'm going to tell you guys exactly what you need so you all can vote. And for most people, it's easy. That for select people who are targeted by these laws, there's extra steps to take, and we're going to make sure that we provide accurate information. But the thing is that we want to be positive about voting. We know that voter suppression exists, but we want everyone to know that this is something that we can overcome in the long term, that we can work on together, and that in the short term that we have resources and we have their back. We'll get them to the DMV, we'll get you the student ID that you need so that you can vote. So if you only remember anything, it's fireworks. Stay positive that this is the last thing that we want to do is discourage anyone from voting. And that all the stories, all this work, are to know that as we vote and as we continue to build together, that this is something that we can improve. Another thing that we're working on is bridging this information gap. So for folks who need help, to the resources that they need. So we have billboards in Madison, in Milwaukee, in Racine, in Beloit, in Green Bay, in different places that suffered some of the biggest decrease in voter turnout. And all the folks on it are real voters, real people who live and vote in Milwaukee, or kids who live and vote there. And same with bus ads. So that whole idea of how can we make sure that we're meeting people where they're at and talking to people where they're at. Also, what would you guys do if I told you that we created a really cool easy-to-use, accessible website to vote. Have you guys ever seen anything like that? Because they're all pretty, not as exciting, right? How many of you guys have used the website or looked at different materials online to learn how to register to vote or vote? How many of them were exciting? Exactly. So I'll leave this website up at the end, but we created easy resources to make sure that you all have something to share, something to use, and something that we can go through and use as a resource to make sure that you're getting the information you need and that everybody has this access to the ballot. Same, we have a helpline. So if you guys have a question, if you're talking with folks later and say, you know, this one thing came up, I don't really know the answer to that. No one has to be an expert. You don't have to be an expert talking to your friends and encouraging them to vote. Instead, just call us. You'll get a call back and we'll make sure that you get the information that you need, or that your friends or your family or your parents in another city get the information that they need so that they can vote. The other really exciting thing is that we talked nationally about different things that are happening and how we're expanding voting rights. That this is absolutely, you know, make no mistake, this is a critical time for democracy, but this is also a really exciting time. That in Michigan, right now there's a couple different ballot measures on the ballot that would be so awesome and so expansive for voting rights. One of them is something we have in Wisconsin. It's on the ballot. It says it's called Proposal 3, and it's a yes or no vote, and that is for Election Day registration. So how many of you guys procrastinate? Yes. Procrastinators should not be punished because they're not registered a certain amount of days ahead of time in order to vote. In Wisconsin, you can register, you can vote on Election Day, and other states, like Michigan, are putting that on the ballot so everybody can have access to the ballot. We can be as inclusive as possible. A similar thing happening in Florida, something that Dr. Broussard touched on, that right now in Florida, there are about 1.6 million people who have a felony conviction and have been barred from voting for life. So we're talking, for many people, something they have done decades ago and still have not been able to vote, even though they have fully completed their sentence, all probation, all parole, all extended supervision. They're back working, part of communities, part of society, paying taxes, and still can't vote. And that's wrong. And so that's on the ballot this fall, this November, in Florida for those voters to decide on. How many of you believe in second chances? Exactly. And the last awesome thing that everybody can do to get involved, I know that there's, did you know you can be a poll worker? So you can be, 1, sign up, 2, it's a day, 3, did you know you get paid to be a poll worker? How many of you have seen, think of poll workers generally as somebody who is much older? Exactly. And so it's something that we can all do, that we can all get involved, get paid, and we need younger poll workers. We need poll workers who are students, who are different races. We want our poll workers to be just as inclusive as our entire democracy and just as reflective of the communities in which they serve. And so that's, if you go to be a poll worker, there's another way to get involved. So there's so many exciting things happening, and I want to make sure too, happy to answer questions to make sure everyone has access to information. And I have this last slide blank, and blank for a reason, because in democracy, nothing is permanent. It's evolving. Nobody's going to be in office forever. This next slide we're creating right now. This is how we want our country to look, how we want our lawmakers to look, how we want our policies to reflect what we want and our values. Next year I'll have a slide here, and we're deciding when we vote what that slide is going to be and what we want this to look like. So I am happy to answer any questions that you all have, and also I would love to hear any feedback, comments that you have as well. Just wondering about anything, something that wasn't clear. Yes?
Why were voter ID laws passed in the first place?
That's a really great question. Why were voter ID laws passed in the first place, right? Because what purpose do they serve? And the purpose that is identified that they serve is to combat voter fraud, to stop people who would come and say, you know, I'm Molly McGrath, I'm going to vote, and it would be somebody pretending to be me. So instead, they would need to show a name and photo to show that they were indeed Molly McGrath and not going to impersonate that person into voting, right? So, okay, well that's what they say, but there's two big problems with that. One is how much voter fraud is really happening, right? Well, the very first law that they passed was in Indiana, and that law went to the Supreme Court. And they said, well, what's the problem there? But how much voter fraud is happening? And it was either 0 to like 1 instance in this long history. And in fact, a study done that Dr. Broussard talked about a little bit said from 2000 to 2014, millions and millions of votes cast, not just in Wisconsin, but across the entire country. There were, it's either 32 or 34 instances of voter fraud. I can tell you that I have talked to myself to 10 times more than that of people who have been disenfranchised in just one election than those instances of voter fraud. So that's what they say. The first problem is the fraud. The second problem is, okay, well, if figuring out that Molly McGrath is Molly McGrath and that's really what you're after, then why didn't you take Gladys's ID? Because that's her name and that's her photo. Well, then why are you not taking student IDs in Texas? And why are you making student IDs here in Wisconsin have all these extra requirements? Because the only thing different on there is a signature, and we're not checking that on voter ID. We're checking the name and photo. So why are you targeting so many different communities if you're really saying that the justification is to prevent voter fraud? That was a good question. Anybody else?